Hello, this is Chris Ferrara, and this is Fatima Perspectives, a series of commentaries and discussions on the state of affairs in the Church today in light of the message of Fatima. For the last few episodes, I've invited my friend and colleague John Vennari to participate in the show, and I welcome you again, John. Thank you for coming.
Chris. Good to be here.
We've been discussing something on and off for months since the appearance of what many have called the recyclical Laudato Si on the environment. I mean, I can't think of anything less appropriate in the midst of civilizational apostasy than an encyclical on the environment. But one aspect we've been kicking around is this actually quite shocking and disheartening explicit rehabilitation in a footnote to the encyclical cited to by a major passage of Teilhard de Chardin, that great fraud whose writings were twice denounced by the Holy Office, most recently under Pope John the 23rd, just before the Second Vatican Council.
Mm-hmm. Well, there's nothing much subtle about this. I mean, and there's no apology for it. He just cites him approvingly. And of course, the people who Francis admires, the liberal Cardinal Martini, the rootin' tootin' Leonardo Boff, the liberation theologian. Boff is Teilhardian through and through, and we know that as far back as 2013, Francis contacted Boff and asked Boff to send him his writings on the environment so he could use it to prepare this new encyclical.
You've shown convincingly in an address you gave, and I think you've written on it as well, that the influence of Boff in this document is pervasive.
Yeah, it's there.
But in terms of Teilhard, the favorable citation to Teilhard, the first time, by the way, that Teilhard has received favorable mention in a papal encyclical, after having been condemned as a threat to the faithful, from which the youth should be protected by John the 23rd, according to John the 23rd. This is the first time we've seen this in a papal encyclical. And here's the passage. The end of the way of the universe is the fullness of God, which has already been achieved by the risen Christ, fulcrum of the universal maturation. Now, as the modernists love to say, let us unpack this. It sounds like nonsense.
Does it mean that God is not full right now?
Yeah, here's what he's saying. The end of the way of the universe is the fullness of God, which has already been achieved by the risen Christ. Christ is God. So he's saying that the risen Christ has achieved the fullness of God. God has achieved his own fullness. So God is subject to evolution. And this was Teilhard's thesis. Christ himself is evolving. He is the omega point who arrives at the omega point after being the alpha through evolution. So he is not only the evolver, but the evolved. And this is what we're seeing here, that Christ reaches his maturation and then acts as the fulcrum of the universal maturation. What is the universal maturation? Evolution.
Now, in what context is he using this? I mean, it's in a footnote. What is he attaching it to?
The idea that all things are connected and all things are moving toward their final maturation. Yeah. In other words, all things are evolving. So then he goes on to say, the final end of other creatures is not in us. Instead, all advance together with us and through us toward the common destination, which is God, in a transcendent fullness where the risen Christ embraces and illuminates everything. So all creatures are moving toward heaven.
Tadpoles,
centipedes, worms,
amoeba,
termites, blood-sucking parasites, you name it. Everything is moving towards this.
And they're going to receive this great cosmic embrace at the
end. And all dogs apparently do go to heaven.
Yeah, sure, yeah.
Which is certainly not what Pope Benedict taught or what John Paul II taught. They both spoke on the issue of whether animals have immortal souls or an eternal destiny, and they don't, obviously. They're creatures who, as St. Thomas says, have what is called certain powers of the soul, the appetitive soul and the vegetative soul. These things are basic to all creatures, but their souls die with them.
Because they're it's an organic.
Yeah, but they don't have an eternal destiny. So this idea that all creatures are moving toward God and that all creatures will reach God in some kind of eternal consummation, which appears to be the Teilhardian omega point. There's one website, which is for fans of Teilhard pointed out, celebrating this encyclical. This idea appearing in a papal encyclical is pretty darn disturbing, don't you think?
Well, it's quite disturbing, and also what does that say, too, regarding Francis's respect for his predecessors?
None. He doesn't care about the prior condemnations. He doesn't care about what John the 23rd said. He said in his monitum issued by the Holy Office in 1962 that all rectors of universities, all pastors of souls, all instructors of the youth should be on their guard against the errors of Teilhard de Chardin. What could be more clear than that? That this man and his nonsense, his evolutionary nonsense, his attempt to baptize Darwin's theory and intermingle it with Catholic theology, was a disaster for the church that leads to all kinds of errors. One of the errors it leads to is essentially the denial of man's distinct existence. Because if everything is evolving towards an omega point, where is man with his immortal soul and his eternal destiny? Where are the natures of things that are fixed by God himself in the first act of creation?
There's no fixed natures in evolution. I mean, there's no formal cause and no final cause.
No, everything is evolving toward the omega point. And now we find this kind of thing creeping into a papal encyclical, this pseudo-mysticism of Teilhard de Chardin. I mean, I don't know what more to say about it except that it's just another example of why this encyclical appears to me to be a Magna Carta, so to speak, for the next stage in what Paul VI himself admitted is the auto-demolition of the church. It seems there's something still standing. They haven't finished their work of auto-demolition. So now it's time to introduce evolutionary thinking into the church in a formal way and teach the people, as if this were possible, that everything is evolving toward the omega point.
Well, I remember I used to simply explain Teilhard to people by saying that in Teilhard's cosmology, the only difference between me and a rock is that I am conscious of myself and the rock isn't. That's pretty much Teilhard. I mean, if you really want to boil it down, and that matter of billions of years ago evolved into spirit somehow. Therefore, it gave itself something that it didn't have.
Well, what Francis talks about, the emergence of a personal being from the physical universe.
Evolution 101.
Yeah, I mean, man did not emerge from the physical universe. God reached down into creation and specially created Adam, and then created Eve from the side of Adam. And Pope Leo XIII, in his encyclical on Christian marriage, said these are facts that no one may deny. That while Adam was locked in sleep, God, in miraculous fashion, took Eve from his side so that the two, man and woman, are one flesh. And he was only affirming what the church has always affirmed, what every church father affirmed, the special creation of Adam and Eve, not through an emergence of man in the physical universe.
And this is something, too, that a number of people would read that sentence and they wouldn't catch that emerging bit. So what we have is we don't have, say, Leo XIII explicitly denied. We kind of have this eclipse of language, of subtle and ambiguous language that does actually eclipse the old doctrine, but not in a way that everybody can see.
So much so, John, that God himself apparently becomes subject to the requirements of evolution. On one occasion, Francis, speaking to the Pontifical Academy of Atheism, Pontifical Academy of Science,
Yeah.
said, and I quote, "When we read about creation in Genesis, we run the risk of imagining a God who was a magician, complete with magic wand, able to do everything. But that is not so."
That's
really?
blasphemous.
God is not able to do everything? Really?
That's blasphemous.
And you reduce God to a magician if he simply creates man directly and spontaneously?
Well, as Dr. Waters would say to Francis, he didn't say this to Francis, but he would say, you tell us more about yourself by that statement than you do about what you're trying to say about God.
This is why, as Bishop Athanasius Schneider said, we are in the midst of the greatest crisis, or the fourth great crisis in the history of the church. Let's continue this on another occasion, John. Meanwhile, this is Chris Ferrara, and this has been Fatima Perspectives.